Hey, welcome back, and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Sanic, and tonight we're going to take a quiet journey into the past to explore what winter was really like for medieval farmers. This isn't a fast story or a dramatic one. It's a slow look at everyday life, routine, and survival during the coldest months of the medieval year. If you're listening while resting or falling asleep, you're in the right place. And if you'd like, you can leave a comment sharing what time you're watching this. Now, get comfortable and let's gently step into a medieval winter. Winter did not arrive suddenly for medieval farmers. It announced itself slowly through small changes that were noticed long before the cold truly settled in. The days shortened first. The sun rose later and disappeared earlier, pulling warmth away from the fields a little at a time. By late autumn, the land already felt quieter. The sounds of harvest faded. Fields that had once been full of movement stood empty and still. The soil hardened, and the air carried a sharpness that lingered even during the day. For farmers, this change was not simply seasonal, it was deeply emotional. Winter meant waiting, waiting without certainty. The last weeks before winter were filled with careful attention. Every remaining task mattered. Grain was gathered and stored. Root vegetables were pulled from the ground and placed in cool, dark spaces. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be replaced until spring. Animals became the center of thought. Cows, pigs, hens, and sheep were not just livestock, they were living stores of food, warmth, and labor. Keeping them alive through winter meant keeping the household alive as well. Farmers inspected barns carefully. Roofs were checked for leaks. Gaps were stuffed with straw or mud to block wind. Animals would spend long months indoors, breathing warmth into shared spaces. The decision of which animals to keep and which to slaughter was never easy. Pigs were often killed in late autumn, their meat salted or smoked for winter meals. This was not celebration, it was necessity. The smell of smoke and curing meat filled villages during these weeks. Fat was rendered slowly, bones were saved, nothing was discarded. Winter demanded thoroughness. Cows were usually spared if possible. They provided milk, even if less in winter, and represented future calves. Losing a cow could mean losing survival in the years ahead. Hens were protected carefully. Eggs became rare in winter, but feathers, meat, and manure were still valuable. Children were often tasked with feeding them, even on cold mornings. As animals were brought closer, homes felt more crowded. In many farmhouses, animals shared walls with people. Sometimes they shared the same structure entirely. Their warmth mattered. Inside the house, preparations continued. Tools were cleaned and repaired. Broken handles were replaced. Blades were sharpened. Winter offered fewer opportunities to fix mistakes. Clothing was examined closely. Wool garments were patched again and again. Holes were sewn shut. Extra layers were prepared because winter clothing was not replaced easily. Shoes were especially important. Wet feet in winter could be deadly. Farmers checked soles carefully, knowing repairs would be difficult once snow and mud took over the roads. Food storage was checked constantly. Grain sacks were moved, inspected for moisture or pests. Rodents were a constant threat. Families expected some loss, but hoped to limit it. As the final autumn days passed, a quiet tension settled over the household. Winter meant fewer choices. Once the cold fully arrived, movement would slow, travel would become risky, help would be harder to find. Farmers watched the sky closely. Early frost brought worry. A sudden snowfall could trap people unprepared. Weather shaped mood as much as labor. Obligations did not disappear with the cold. Lords still demanded taxes. Rent was still owed. Grain, animals, or labor were claimed even as supplies dwindled. The king was distant, unseen, yet always present. His wars, courts, and needs traveled downward through layers of authority, eventually reaching the farm. Winter did not excuse these demands. For farmers, winter was not a time of rest. It was a test of endurance. The goal was simple: reach spring alive, with enough strength left to begin again. As nights grew longer, families gathered closer around the hearth. Firewood was rationed carefully, flames were kept small, warmth was shared, conversation slowed, movement slowed, life turned inward. Outside, the land slept. Inside, people waited. This was the beginning of winter on a medieval farm, and once it began, there was no turning back. By the time winter truly arrived, the fields were already empty. The wheat had been cut, the barley gathered, the last vegetables pulled from the ground before frost could take them. What remained was bare earth, hardened by cold and silence. For medieval farmers, winter was not a season of growth, but of waiting, waiting for warmth, for light, and for survival. The pace of life changed dramatically once the harvest ended. Summer and autumn demanded constant movement. Winter demanded patience. Days grew shorter, and work shifted away from the fields and into barns, sheds, and dimly lit homes. There was still labor to be done, but it was slower, quieter, and often lonelier. Animals became the center of daily responsibility. Cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens were no longer just livestock. They were warmth, food, and future security. Farmers rose before sunrise, even in the coldest months, to check on them. Breath formed clouds in the air as barn doors creaked open. Inside, the smell of hay, manure, and animal warmth filled the space, offering a small comfort against the freezing air outside. Cows were especially important during winter. They provided milk when pasture was gone, though far less than in summer. That milk was carefully used to make butter and cheese, preserved foods that could last weeks or even months. Nothing was wasted. Every drop mattered. A sick cow in winter could mean disaster for an entire household. Pigs were treated differently. Many pigs were slaughtered in late autumn before winter fully set in. Their meat was salted, smoked, or dried to survive the cold months ahead. Pork became one of the most reliable winter foods, eaten slowly and carefully, often stretched across many meals. The fat was just as valuable as the meat, used for cooking, lamps, and even basic medicine. Chickens were kept alive through winter if possible, though egg production dropped sharply. Farmers fed them scraps and grain saved from the harvest, hoping for the occasional egg. In severe winters, some birds did not survive, frozen or weakened by hunger. Loss was expected. Planning for loss was part of medieval life. Inside the home, winter felt heavy. Medieval houses were cold even on good days. Walls were thin. Windows, if they existed at all, were covered with cloth, wood, or oiled parchment instead of glass. Smoke from the hearth filled the air, stinging eyes and lungs, but it was necessary. Fire was life. Without it, winter nights could be deadly. Most families gathered around the hearth as evening fell. This was where cooking happened, where tools were repaired, where stories were told quietly to pass the time. Light came from the fire and from small, smoky oil lamps or candles made of tallow. Shadows moved constantly along the walls, making the long nights feel even longer. Food in winter was simple and repetitive. Bread made from coarse grain, stews of beans, cabbage, onions, and whatever meat could be spared. Thick soups that stretched small amounts of food across many mouths. Spices were rare luxuries for farmers. Flavor came from herbs dried during summer and autumn, stored carefully to last until spring. Hunger was never far away. Even in good years, food stores dwindled by late winter. This period, often called the hungry months, tested everyone. Meals grew smaller, meat disappeared first, replaced by bread and broth. Parents often ate less so children could eat more, though no one spoke of it openly. Winter was also a time of quiet fear. Illness spread easily in cold, crowded homes. A simple cough could turn deadly. Medical knowledge was limited, and doctors were expensive or non existent in rural areas. Most farmers relied on home remedies, prayers, and hope. Despite hardship, winter brought moments of closeness. Families spent more time together than during the busy farming seasons. Tools were mended, clothes were patched, wool was spun and woven by firelight. Children learned skills by watching and helping, their education shaped by necessity rather than books. Outside, the world felt still. Snow muffled sound. Fields lay dormant beneath frost. Paths between villages became dangerous or impassable. Travel slowed to a crawl. News arrived late, if at all. For weeks at a time, a family might see no one beyond their own household. Yet winter was not only endured, it was respected. Farmers understood that rest, even forced rest, was part of the land's rhythm. The earth needed time to recover, just as people did. Surviving winter meant reaching spring, and spring meant another chance. As nights grew long and the fire burned low, medieval farmers lived one day at a time. They counted meals, watched the weather, listened for animals stirring in the barn. They waited, patiently, quietly, knowing that winter always ended, but never knowing exactly how much it would take with it before it did. As winter deepened, the cold became something more than discomfort. It became a constant presence, shaping every decision and every movement. Medieval farmers did not think of winter as a season that passed gently. It arrived in stages, and by midwinter, it ruled everything. Snow covered the land for weeks, sometimes months. Paths disappeared beneath white drifts. Familiar landmarks faded, fields that once demanded endless labor now lay silent and unreachable. The world felt smaller, limited to the short distance between house, barn, and well. Anything beyond that became uncertain. Cold seeped into homes, no matter how carefully they were built. Even with a hearth burning, frost could form on the inside of walls. Floors were bare earth or rough wood, always cold beneath bare feet. Straw was spread across sleeping areas to provide insulation, and families often slept close together, not for comfort, but for warmth. At night, the fire was allowed to burn low. Fuel was precious, and no one could afford to keep a large flame alive until morning. This meant that families woke to freezing air, breath visible indoors. The first task of each day was reviving the fire, coaxing warmth back into the house with shaking hands and stiff fingers. Outside, animals faced their own struggle. Barns were built close to homes for a reason. Farmers checked on livestock several times a day, even during storms. Snow had to be cleared from roofs to prevent collapse. Water troughs froze solid and had to be broken open again and again. A frozen water source could kill an animal faster than hunger. Cows and sheep huddled together for warmth. Their bodies produced heat, turning barns into small pockets of life in an otherwise frozen world. Farmers understood this instinctively. Keeping animals alive through winter was as important as feeding their own families. Losing livestock meant losing milk, meat, wool, and future income. Pigs that remained alive were kept sheltered and fed carefully. They consumed scraps, spoiled grain, and anything that could still provide calories. Nothing was wasted. In winter, waste was a luxury no one could afford. Storms were feared more than hunger. A sudden blizzard could trap a family indoors for days. Snow piled against doors and windows, sealing people inside their homes. If the roof collapsed, there was no help coming. If food ran low, There was no quick solution. Survival depended entirely on preparation and luck. Wind was especially dangerous. It cut through wool and leather as if they were thin cloth. Frostbite was common, especially on fingers, toes, ears, and noses. Farmers wrapped their faces with cloth when working outside, but even then, exposure could cause permanent damage. Illness became more frequent in deep winter. Cold weakened bodies, smoke filled air irritated lungs, coughs echoed through small homes, sometimes lingering for weeks. A fever in winter was terrifying. Keeping someone warm while preventing the spread of illness was nearly impossible in a single room house. Children were especially vulnerable. They played less outside, spending long days indoors with limited light and space. Their energy had nowhere to go. Parents worried constantly, watching for signs of sickness, listening to breathing at night, hoping the cold would spare them. Despite this, winter was not silent. Wood cracked in the fire, wind howled through gaps in walls, animals shifted and stamped in their stalls. Snow slid from rooftops in sudden thuds. These sounds became part of daily life, familiar and oddly comforting. Even in the harshest cold, work continued. Tools were repaired, handles were replaced, ropes were twisted, baskets were woven. These quiet tasks filled the hours when daylight was scarce and movement outside was dangerous. Hands stayed busy because the idleness invited worry. Faith played a stronger role in winter. Prayers were spoken more often, not always formally, but quietly under breath. People asked for protection, for warmth, for the strength to endure until spring. Churches, when reachable, offered not only spiritual comfort, but physical warmth and human presence. Winter forced reflection. There was time to think, to remember past winters, to count losses and small victories. Farmers remembered which years had been worse, which had been kinder. Stories were told, not for entertainment alone, but as reminders that survival was possible. As days slowly began to lengthen, almost imperceptibly, hope returned in small ways, not because winter had ended, but because it had been endured so far. Each morning survived was a success. Each animal still breathing was a blessing. Medieval farmers did not measure winter by weeks or months. They measured it by fires kept alive, by food remaining in storage, by animals still standing, and by the quiet strength required to face another frozen morning. And so, deep in winter's grip, life narrowed, slowed, and endured, waiting patiently for the distant promise of thaw. By the heart of winter, survival depended less on strength and more on restraint. The work of medieval farmers during these months was not about producing more, but about making what already existed last long enough. Every decision around food, fuel, and animals carried weight. Food stores were checked constantly. Grain sacks were opened carefully, never poured too freely. Bread was baked in measured amounts, enough for a day or two, never more. Flour was coarse and heavy, ground months earlier, and stored in wooden chests or clay jars, always vulnerable to damp, mold, and pests. A spoiled sack could mean weeks of hunger. Bread was the foundation of winter meals. Dense, dark loaves made from rye or barley filled stomachs but offered little comfort. Fresh bread was rare. Most was eaten stale or softened in broth. Children learned early not to complain. Hunger was not dramatic, but persistent, a dull presence that followed in each meal. Meat, once plentiful in autumn, became carefully rationed. Salted pork hung from beams or rested in barrels. Smoked meats were sliced thin, added to stews more for flavor than nourishment. Even bones were saved, boiled repeatedly to draw out every last bit of sustenance. Nothing edible was thrown away. Vegetables survived winter only if preserved. Cabbages, turnips, onions, and beans formed the backbone of meals. Root cellars, dug deep into the ground, kept produce from freezing, though spoilage was always a risk. Farmers checked these stores often, removing anything that showed signs of rot before it spread. Dairy products became increasingly valuable. Cheese made in autumn was eaten slowly, cut into small pieces, and shared carefully. Butter, when available, was used sparingly. Milk itself was rare by deep winter, as cows produced less and less. Each animal's health was watched closely, because losing a cow meant losing far more than meat. Animals were not just food, but living investments. Farmers avoided slaughtering livestock in winter unless absolutely necessary. Keeping animals alive meant future milk, wool, eggs, and labor. Even aging animals were often spared because their continued existence held value beyond immediate hunger. Firewood was rationed as strictly as food. Large fires were avoided unless absolutely necessary. Most hearths burned low and steady, just enough to keep frost from forming inside the home. Families layered clothing instead of adding fuel. Cloaks, woolen tunics, and patched garments were worn indoors as much as outside. Cooking itself changed in winter. Meals were simple and slow. Stews simmered for hours, not only to cook tough ingredients, but to heat the home. Cooking and warmth were inseparable. The hearth became the center of life, where food, light, and comfort came together. Meals were eaten quietly. Conversation was soft, measured. People ate with an awareness of scarcity, chewing slowly, mindful of portions. Children learned to wait. Adults learned to endure. Food was nourishment, not pleasure. Even animals sensed the restraint of winter. Hens scratched through snow and straw, hoping for scraps. Pigs grunted softly, conserving energy. Dogs stayed close to the fire, rarely straying far. The entire household, human and animal alike, settled into a slower rhythm. Winter meals followed a predictable pattern. Morning might bring bread and thin broth. Midday offered something warmer if work demanded it. Evening meals were the heartiest, shared together before darkness fully set in. After eating, dishes were cleaned carefully, often with cold water and rough cloth. Faith and superstition shaped how food was treated. Spilled grain was considered a bad omen. Moldy bread was sometimes scraped clean and eaten anyway. People whispered thanks before meals, not always formally, but sincerely, knowing how close hunger always was. Despite scarcity, sharing still existed. Neighbors who had slightly more might quietly help those with less. A loaf left at a door, a bit of meat added to a pot. These acts were rarely spoken of. Pride mattered, but survival mattered more. As winter stretched on, discipline became habit. Rationing no longer felt forced, it became routine. Medieval farmers understood that restraint now meant survival later. Every saved portion was a promise to the future. And so, through careful choices and quiet endurance, households moved slowly through winter, guided not by abundance, but by patience, memory, and the hard earned knowledge of what it took to last until spring. Even in winter, when fields lay frozen and food was scarce, medieval farmers were rarely free from obligation. The cold did not pause authority. Lords, monasteries, and kings still expected their share, and winter often made those demands feel heavier than ever. Most farmers did not own the land they worked. They lived on estates controlled by a local lord, noble, or religious institution. In exchange for protection and the right to farm, they owed rent, labor, or food. These obligations followed the farmer through every season, including winter. Food was the most common form of payment. Grain, meat, cheese, eggs, and wool were collected as rent or tax. Much of what farmers carefully preserved for winter had already been claimed months earlier. What remained was what the Lord had not taken, not what the farmer had freely chosen to keep. Winter made this imbalance painfully clear. While farmers rationed meals and burned low fires, manor houses and castles were better insulated, better supplied, and guarded by stores collected from the surrounding land. Smoke rose steadily from stone chimneys, a visible reminder of where food and warmth had gone. Castles and monasteries relied entirely on peasant labor. The bread eaten by nobles, the meat served at feasts, and the ale poured in halls all began in the hands of farmers. Yet those same farmers rarely tasted abundance themselves. Their work supported others first. Some obligations were seasonal. Harvest time brought the largest demands, but winters still required labor. Farmers were expected to repair roads, cut timber, maintain estate buildings, and care for the Lord's animals. Even in snow, service continued. In return, protection was promised. Lords offered defense against bandits or rival nobles, at least in theory. In reality, protection was uneven. If war or conflict came in winter, it often fell hardest on farmers. Armies took food, burned barns, and slaughtered livestock without permission or payment. Kings were distant figures to most farmers. Their authority was real but abstract. Taxes passed through many hands before reaching royal treasuries. A farmer might never see a king, but would feel his presence through collectors, laws, and demands enforced by local power. Church institutions also held great influence. Tithes, typically a tenth of produce, were owed regardless of weather or harvest quality. Even in lean years, payment was expected. Faith offered comfort, but it also demanded sacrifice. Winter made resentment grow quietly, not loudly, not in rebellion, but in thought. Farmers noticed who ate well and who went hungry. They remembered which winters were hardest, and who offered help, and who did not. These memories shaped trust across generations. Still, open defiance was rare. The risk was too great. Punishment could mean loss of land, imprisonment, or worse. Survival required obedience as much as endurance. Farmers learned to endure injustice the same way they endured cold. Yet relationships were not always cruel. Some lords reduced demands in severe winters. Some monasteries offered food to the poorest. Acts of mercy existed, though they depended entirely on individual character rather than law. Winter revealed the structure of medieval society more clearly than any other season. Those with power stayed warm, those without learned to endure. Food was not just nourishment, but currency, control, and survival. For farmers, winter was not only a test of nature, but of hierarchy. They survived the cold not just with fire and food, but with patience, silence, and the quiet understanding of their place in a world that depended on them, yet rarely rewarded them. And as snow fell outside cottages and barns, medieval farmers carried on, knowing that even in the deepest winter, their labor still fed the world above them. As winter settled in fully, animals were no longer something kept at a distance. They became part of daily survival in ways that blurred the line between household and barn. For medieval farmers, animals were not abstract resources. They were present, breathing, warm, and closely watched. In the coldest months, animals were kept as close as possible. Barns were often attached to homes or built just a few steps away. Some smaller animals, like chickens or newborn livestock, were occasionally brought inside during extreme cold. Their body heat mattered, their survival mattered. Farmers knew every animal by habit and instinct. They noticed changes quickly: a cow that ate less, a pig that moved slowly, a hen that stopped scratching. These signs carried weight because winter gave little room for recovery. An animal that fell ill rarely returned to health. Slaughter in winter was a serious decision. It was not done lightly or casually. Killing an animal meant food now, but loss later. Families weighed hunger against future survival. Sometimes an animal was too weak to last until spring, and its meat was taken before it was lost entirely. When slaughter happened, it followed a serial rhythm. Nothing was wasted. Meat was cut and preserved, fat was rendered, bones were boiled, hides were cleaned and saved, even blood was sometimes used in cooking. The process was quiet, focused, and practical. Cooking in winter was slow and repetitive. Large pots sat over the hearth for hours, simmering stews thick with beans, cabbage, onions, and scraps of meat. The smell filled the house, mingling with smoke and damp wool. Meals were warm, not exciting, but deeply necessary. The hearth never truly rested. Even when no food was cooking, embers were kept alive beneath ash. Letting the fire die meant danger. Restarting it without flint or dry wood was difficult, sometimes impossible. Fire was guarded as carefully as food. Meals brought the household together. Everyone ate from the same pot. Portions were small but equal. Children learned patience early, waiting for the ladle, watching steam rise, listening to the crackle of wood. Talking was minimal, eating was deliberate. Animals shaped daily schedules, morning checks, midday feeding, evening inspections before darkness fully arrived. Farmers listened for movement in the barn at night, alert to sounds that might signal trouble. A distressed animal could not be ignored, even in freezing conditions. Winter also deepened attachment. Animals that survived year after year became familiar presences. Losing one felt personal even when necessity demanded it. Farmers lived with this contradiction constantly, caring deeply for animals they knew might one day feed their family. Children grew up understanding this balance. They helped feed animals. They watched slaughter without ceremony. They learned where food came from, not through explanation, but through daily exposure. Winter taught these lessons quietly. Outside, the world remained still. Snow reflected moonlight. Wind pressed against walls. Inside, firelight flickered across faces and beams. The rhythm of winter nights was slow and steady, shaped by animals breathing nearby and pots simmering gently. In these moments, medieval farm life narrowed to essentials: warmth, food, shelter, quiet company. Everything else faded. The complexity of the wider world mattered less than the simple task of reaching morning, and so winter continued, carried by animals, fire, and patient hands, binding households together through necessity, routine, and the shared work of survival. By deep winter, warmth was no longer something taken for granted. Fire helped, but it was never enough on its own. Medieval farmers survived the cold by layering, repairing, and reusing what little they had, again and again. Clothing was precious. Most farmers owned only a few garments, often worn every day until they could no longer be repaired. Wool was the most important material. It held heat even when damp and could survive years of use. Linen was worn underneath, coarse and rough against the skin. Winter clothing was heavy. Tunics, cloaks, hose, and hoods were layered carefully. Nothing fit perfectly. Much of it was inherited, patched, or reshaped from older garments. A well made cloak could mean the difference between discomfort and danger when stepping outside. Inside the home, people stayed dressed. There was no sense of changing into lighter clothes. Cloaks remained on. Hands were tucked into sleeves. Hoods were worn indoors on the coldest days. Comfort was not the goal, endurance was. Much of winter labor involved wool. Women, and often children, spent long hours spinning fibers by firelight. The steady turn of the spindle filled the silence. Yarn produced in winter would become cloth months later. Winter was preparation for future survival. Weaving was slow and demanding. Looms stood inside homes or nearby buildings. Each movement required focus. Cloth was not decorative, it was functional. Warmth mattered more than beauty. Repairs were constant. Tiers were stitched, soles were reinforced, sleeves were lengthened, shoes were especially vulnerable. Leather cracked in cold and damp conditions. A damaged shoe could lead to frostbite or injury. Footwear was simple and fragile. Many farmers wore thin leather shoes with little insulation. Straw or cloth was sometimes stuffed inside for warmth. When shoes failed, people wrapped feet in rags and hoped the cold would be brief. Children learned these skills early. They threaded needles, they watched hands move. Winter taught patience through repetition. These quiet tasks filled long evenings when daylight faded early and the world outside felt unreachable. Warmth also came from bodies. Families sat close. Animals nearby added heat. Sleeping arrangements were practical. Several people shared one bed. Children slept together. Privacy mattered less than survival. The night was the hardest time. Fire burned low. Cold crept back in. Breath fogged the air. People woke stiff and sore. Morning meant coaxing warmth back into the house slowly. Despite hardship, winter labor gave structure. Hands stayed busy, minds stayed focused. Idleness invited worry, so work filled the hours gently, steadily. In this way, winter became a season of making rather than growing. Cloth replaced crops, repair replaced harvest, preparation replaced production. And as snow lay unmoving outside, medieval farmers stitched, spun, and waited, wrapped in layers of wool and quiet determination, carrying themselves patiently toward another day. Winter was the season when sickness felt closest. Cold weakened bodies, darkness lingered, and homes filled with smoke and damp air. For medieval farmers, illness was not an interruption to life. It was an ever present risk that moved quietly through the household. Coughs were common in winter. They echoed softly in small homes, lingering for weeks. Smoke from the hearth irritated lungs, while cold air strained breathing. What began as discomfort could turn dangerous without warning. Fever was feared most. A fever in winter meant weakness, confusion, and the inability to work. When someone fell ill, the household slowed around them. Others took over chores, fed animals, carried water, and kept the fire alive. Survival became shared responsibility. Medical care was limited or non existent. Doctors were rare in rural areas, and their knowledge was uncertain. Most families relied on tradition, memory, and faith. Herbs dried in summer were brewed into teas. Warm cloths were placed on foreheads. Rest was encouraged when possible, though it was often a luxury. Women played a central role in care. They knew which plants eased pain, which foods were easiest to swallow, and how to keep someone warm without wasting fuel. Care was quiet, steady, and constant. There were no cures, only comfort and hope. Children learned early to be silent around sickness. They were kept close but careful, aware that illness could spread easily in cramped spaces. Fear was rarely spoken, but always felt. Death was not distant. Most families had experienced loss before. Winter deaths were mourned quickly because cold and work allowed little time for extended grief. Burials were simple. The ground was often frozen, making the process slow and painful. Faith offered explanation and comfort. Illness was seen as a test, a punishment, or a mystery beyond human control. Prayers were whispered beside the fire. Saints were invoked. Acceptance lived alongside hope. Despite fear, daily life continued. Animals still needed feeding. Fires needed tending. Meals still needed cooking. Illness did not stop winter, and winter did not wait for recovery. Those who survived sickness emerged weakened. Strength returned slowly. Work resumed cautiously. Survival was celebrated quietly. Without ceremony, winter taught medieval farmers to live with uncertainty. Health could vanish overnight. Recovery was never guaranteed. What mattered was care, patience, and endurance. And so, as cold nights stretched on, families moved gently through sickness and health alike, bound together by necessity, trust, and the quiet belief that morning would come again. As winter stretched on, the world grew quieter in ways that were impossible to ignore. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, day by day, as snow softened every sound and distance grew harder to cross. For medieval farmers, isolation was not an accident of circumstance. It was a season in itself. Villages slowly turned inward. Paths that once connected homes became narrow lines pressed into snow, then vanished entirely after fresh storms. Neighbors who lived only a short walk away during summer might not be seen for weeks. Travel was avoided unless absolutely necessary, because one slip on ice, one fall into deep snow, could mean injury with no help nearby. The absence of movement changed how time felt. Days blurred together. Without travel or visitors, there were fewer markers to separate one day from the next. Farmers did not count time by dates, but by meals eaten, fires kept alive, and storms endured. News arrived slowly and often incompletely. There were no regular messengers in deep winter. Rumors passed from one household to another only when weather allowed. A birth, an illness, or a death might go unnoticed beyond a small circle for weeks. The silence itself became noticeable. Birdsong faded, insects disappeared, distant human voices were rare. Even livestock seemed quieter, conserving energy. Sound became something that stood out rather than filled the air. The crack of wood in the fire, the wind pressing against walls, the slow crunch of boots in snow. Long nights deepened the sense of separation. Darkness arrived early and lingered. With limited light, households gathered close to the hearth and remained there. The outside world felt distant, unreachable, and unimportant compared to the small space of warmth and fire. Conversation changed during these months. Words were fewer, chosen carefully. Silence was common and accepted. People sat together without speaking, listening to the fire or simply resting. There was no expectation of constant talk. Silence was not emptiness, it was rest. Loneliness took quiet forms. Children missed the noise of play and other voices. Adults missed shared work and casual conversation. But winter offered no solutions. Longing had to be endured, like cold. Storytelling became a bridge across the silence. Older family members spoke of previous winters, of times when food ran lower, storms lasted longer, or illness struck harder. These stories were not meant to frighten, they were meant to reassure, proof that hardship had been survived before. Faith offered structure to the quiet. Prayers marked mornings and nights. Saints' days were remembered even when churches were unreachable. Belief provided explanation where knowledge failed and comfort where certainty did not exist. Isolation encouraged reflection. People thought about the past year and the one to come. They considered repairs needed in spring, fields that would need attention, animals that might not last the winter. Hope and worry existed together, inseparable. Animals softened the loneliness. A dog sleeping near the hearth, a cow shifting in its stall, a hen scratching through straw. These small signs of life mattered more in winter than in any other season. Sometimes isolation broke suddenly. A knock at the door, a neighbor arriving unannounced, bundled in wool, carrying news or asking for help. These visits were brief, but deeply meaningful, remembered long after winter ended. Winter taught medieval farmers how to live with quiet, how to exist without constant movement or distraction, how to endure long stretches of sameness without losing themselves. And so the silence continued, not as an enemy, but as a companion, a reminder that survival was not always loud or dramatic, but slow, patient, and deeply human. When the first signs of thaw appeared, medieval farmers did not celebrate immediately. They watched. Winter had taught them caution. Snow that softened during the day often froze again at night, turning paths into dangerous sheets of ice. A single fall could mean injury, and injury meant vulnerability. Still, change was impossible to ignore. Water began to drip steadily from thatched roofs. Ice cracked in shallow streams. The ground, once solid and unyielding, softened just enough to hold footprints. These signs were quiet, but deeply felt. The cold did not vanish. Morning air remained sharp. Frost still coated fields at dawn. Fires were kept alive, cloaks stayed on, and meals remained simple. Winter had loosened its grip, but it had not released it. Animals sensed the shift before people spoke of it. Cows stirred more often, sheep moved restlessly in their pens, chickens scratched with renewed energy. Their bodies responded instinctively to lengthening days. Even while food remained scarce, farmers inspected their animals carefully. They checked ribs, hooves, coats. Any animal that survived the worst of winter was now precious beyond measure. Losing one at the edge of spring felt especially cruel. Work began to change shape. Instead of repair and waiting, preparation returned. Tools were brought closer to the hearth for sharpening. Plow blades were checked for cracks. Wooden handles were reinforced. Every small task was done slowly, carefully, with tired hands. Fields were visited again, not to work, but to look. Farmers walked the edges, testing soil with boots, feeling its softness, gauging how much frost remained beneath the surface. Too early, and the earth would punish impatience. Food remained scarce. The last of winter's stores were stretched thinner than ever. Hunger did not disappear with the thaw. In fact, it often worsened. Fresh food was still weeks away, and reserves were nearly gone. This was the most dangerous time of year. Bodies were weakened, illness lingered, energy was low. Many did not survive this final stretch, succumbing just before relief arrived. Despite this, hope returned quietly, not loudly, not joyfully, but steadily. Farmers spoke of planting again, of fields waking, of animals grazing freely. These conversations were cautious, but real. Faith shifted tone. Prayers moved from endurance toward gratitude, not for abundance, but for survival, for reaching this point at all. Children noticed the light first. They lingered outside a little longer. They watched snow melt into mud. They sensed freedom approaching, even if they did not fully understand the risks still present. The home changed too. Doors opened more often. Smoke escaped more easily. The air inside felt less heavy. Winter's confinement loosened, yet farmers did not forget what winter had taken. They remembered losses. They carried fatigue forward. Survival left marks that did not vanish with snow. The thaw was not an ending, it was a transition, a fragile bridge between endurance and renewal, and medieval farmers crossed it carefully, step by step, knowing that spring offered promise, but never guarantees. Early spring did not feel like a new beginning to medieval farmers. It felt uncertain. The snow was mostly gone, but the cold had not truly left. The ground softened during the day and hardened again at night. Every step outside was taken carefully because the season itself felt unstable. This was a time of watching more than acting. Farmers rose early and stepped outside to test the air. They studied the sky. They felt the soil with their hands, pressing fingers into earth that had been frozen for months. If the ground was worked too early, seeds would rot. If planting was delayed too long, harvest would suffer. Timing mattered more now than at any other moment of the year. Animals emerged slowly from winter weakness. Cows were thinner, their bones visible beneath dull coats. Sheep moved cautiously, still conserving energy. Chickens laid eggs again, but irregularly. Each small sign of recovery brought relief, but also responsibility. Animals needed careful feeding, not too much, not too little. Sudden changes could kill them just as surely as winter cold. Farmers began letting animals outside for short periods, not to graze fully, but to stretch, to feel open air. Fresh grass was scarce, but the movement itself mattered. Too much exposure, however, risked illness. Everything was measured. Inside the home, routines shifted again. Winter tasks slowly ended. Spinning slowed. Repairs were finished or abandoned. Attention turned outward. Doors opened more often. Light filled the house longer each day. Food remained dangerously low. Spring hunger was often worse than winter hunger. Winter stores were nearly empty, and new food had not yet arrived. This was when desperation quietly grew. Some families foraged for early greens. Others boiled roots meant for seed. Choices were made carefully, but sometimes with no good options. This period tested discipline. Eating too much too soon could mean starvation later. Eating too little weakened bodies needed for planting. Farmers balanced survival against future survival, a decision no season demanded more clearly. Social life slowly returned. Neighbors began visiting again. News spread. Losses were acknowledged. Survivors counted who had made it through the winter. These moments were sober, not joyful. Survival was respected, not celebrated. Relations with lords and landowners resumed quickly. Spring meant work. Obligations returned immediately. Fields had to be prepared not only for family survival, but for rents and taxes. Winter hardship did not reduce expectations. Despite exhaustion, work resumed, plows were brought out, oxen were harnessed, the first furrows were cut into soil that resisted every movement. Bodies ached, still weakened by hunger and cold. But stopping was not an option. Spring labor was slower than summer labor, but heavier in its own way. Each movement carried the weight of the past winter. Every seed placed into the ground felt like a gamble. Faith remained close. Farmers prayed over fields quietly, not for wealth, but for enough. Enough grain, enough health, enough time. Children helped again. They carried tools, chased birds from fields, learned where seeds went and why. Their presence reminded adults why endurance mattered. Spring did not erase winter, it carried winter forward, reshaping it into effort, hope, and risk. Medieval farmers stood between seasons, aware that survival had brought them here, but that survival still depended on what came next. Planting season began not with energy, but with fatigue. By the time medieval farmers stepped fully into spring work, their bodies were already worn down by months of cold, hunger, and restraint. Winter had loosened its hold, but it had taken much in return. The fields did not welcome them easily. Soil that had been frozen for months resisted the plow. Clumps of earth broke unevenly. Stones surfaced where frost had pushed them upward. Every row required effort, patience, and repeated correction. Plowing was slow and physically punishing. Oxen or horses pulled with visible strain, their breath rising in steady clouds. Farmers guided the plow with stiff hands, adjusting depth constantly. Too shallow, and seeds would dry out. Too deep, and they would never emerge. Each seed mattered. Grain saved from winter stores was measured carefully. Too much planted now meant hunger later. Too little meant poor harvest. Farmers planted with restraint, trusting experience more than hope. Spring weather was unreliable. Cold rains soaked clothing and chilled weakened bodies. Sudden frost threatened seedlings. A single late freeze could undo days of labor. Farmers watched the sky constantly, alert to every change. Illness lingered during planting. Coughs returned with damp air. Fevers weakened those already underfed. Work continued anyway. Rest was rare. The season demanded movement. Women worked alongside men. They planted, carried seed, repaired tools, and managed homes at the same time. There was no division between survival and labor. Everything blended into a single effort. Children returned to the fields. They chased birds, carried water, learned by watching. Their presence lightened the mood briefly, but also reminded adults of what failure would cost. Animals were worked carefully. Farmers avoided pushing oxen and horses too hard. An injured animal in spring could mean disaster for the entire year. Work was paced not for speed, but for endurance. Meals during planting were thin and rushed. Food was eaten quickly, often cold. Hunger was constant, but ignored. Time mattered more than comfort. Despite exhaustion, purpose returned. Each planted field represented possibility. The future was uncertain, but it was being shaped with every step. Faith followed farmers into the fields. Prayers were spoken quietly over soil and seed, not for abundance, but for fairness. Enough rain, enough sun, enough mercy. Spring was not joyful for medieval farmers. It was demanding, relentless, necessary, but it carried meaning winter did not. The land was alive again, and farmers responded in kind, moving forward with tired bodies and steady resolve, knowing that survival now depended on what they placed into the earth. After the seeds were placed into the soil, medieval farmers entered one of the most difficult periods of the year. There was work to be done, but little that could change the outcome. The fields had been planted, and now everything depended on time, weather, and patience. This waiting was not restful. It carried tension. Farmers walked the edges of fields daily, scanning the soil for signs of life. They searched for tiny breaks in the earth, the first fragile green shoots pushing upward. Each morning brought quiet hope. Each empty patch brought worry. Rain was watched carefully. Too little meant dry soil and failed germination. Too much meant rot. Heavy rain could wash seeds away or pack soil so tightly that nothing could emerge. Every storm was judged not by comfort, but by consequence. Cold still lingered, late frosts were common, and they were feared. A sudden freeze could kill young plants overnight. Farmers rose early on cold mornings, scanning fields for damage, knowing there was nothing they could do to protect most crops. Hunger did not ease during this period. In fact, it often worsened. Winter stores were nearly gone, and the fields offered nothing yet in return. This was the true hungry season, the time when survival felt most uncertain. Foraging became more common. Farmers and children searched hedgerows and woods for early greens, roots, and herbs. Nettles, wild onions, and bitter leaves were gathered carefully. These foods were not pleasant, but they filled stomachs. Meals remained thin. Broth replaced stew. Bread was stretched with fillers. Fat was almost gone. Energy was low, and bodies felt the strain. Work shifted away from the fields. Fences were repaired. Tools were cleaned again and again. Homes were aired out. Barns were checked for damage caused by winter. Everything was done slowly, deliberately. Animals recovered gradually. Cows gained a little strength. Sheep began shedding their winter coats. Chickens laid more consistently. Each improvement mattered, because animals would soon support the household again. Social life cautiously resumed. Neighbors spoke across fields. News spread. Losses were acknowledged. Survival was recognized quietly. There were no celebrations, only shared understanding. Landowners returned with expectations. Spring work meant obligations. Rents would be due. Labor would be demanded. Farmers knew that their own survival did not excuse failure in the eyes of those above them. Despite uncertainty, something changed internally. Purpose returned. The future was no longer abstract. It was growing, slowly, invisibly, beneath the soil. Faith remained steady during this waiting. Prayers were not desperate now, but persistent. Farmers asked for protection, not miracles. Children sensed the shift. They watched fields closely. They learned patience. They learned that effort did not always bring immediate reward. Waiting taught restraint. Medieval farmers understood that rushing the land was pointless. The earth decided its own pace. And so these weeks passed quietly, marked by hope, hunger, and careful observation as farmers waited for the land to answer their labor. At first, the green did not feel real. After weeks of waiting, watching, and uncertainty, the fields finally showed signs of life that lasted more than a day. Small shoots rose from the soil and remained standing each morning. They were still there. Medieval farmers did not celebrate this moment, they acknowledged it quietly. Experience had taught them that growth could still be taken away. A storm, a disease, a dry spell, or pests could undo everything. Still, the land had responded. Rows that once looked empty now showed faint patterns of life. Fields no longer felt silent. They felt active, though slowly. Work returned to the fields in new ways. Farmers walked carefully between rows, removing weeds by hand. They repaired damage caused by animals or water. They protected young plants as best they could, even knowing protection was limited. This work was gentler than planting, but no less important. Every weed removed meant more nourishment for the crop. Every damaged section fixed meant a slightly better chance of survival. Hunger remained, but it began to change. Foraged greens became more plentiful. Early herbs added flavor to meals. Milk increased as animals grazed more freely. Eggs became more regular. These small improvements mattered deeply. They did not bring fullness, but they brought relief. Bodies felt slightly stronger. Movement felt less painful. Sleep came more easily. Emotionally, farmers shifted from endurance to cautious optimism. They spoke of the fields not as hopes, but as responsibilities. Growth meant obligation. Crops now needed protection, not prayer alone. Children spent more time outside. They watched plants grow. They learned which shoots were valuable and which were weeds. They carried water, chased birds, and absorbed lessons without formal teaching. Animals were worked more regularly again. Oxen pulled lighter loads. Sheep grazed steadily. Horses regained strength. Their recovery mirrored the land itself. Despite improvement, fear did not vanish. Farmers watched the sky constantly. Clouds were judged. Winds were noted. Every change felt meaningful. Relations with landowners intensified. As crops grew, expectations sharpened. Landowners visited fields. They calculated potential yields. Farmers knew that success would not mean freedom, only continued survival. Faith took on a quieter tone. Thankfulness replaced desperation, but caution remained. Prayers acknowledged progress while asking for protection against loss. Summer approached slowly. Days lengthened. Warmth became more consistent. The earth dried. Work rhythms stabilized. Yet medieval farmers understood something deeply. Nothing was secure until harvest. Growth was promise, not reward. And so they continued tending fields with steady hands and careful minds, aware that survival was closer now, but still not guaranteed. The land was alive, and they lived alongside it, waiting patiently for the season to finish what it had begun. By midsummer, the land no longer looked fragile, but medieval farmers knew this was not a time to relax. Fields stood taller now. Crops moved gently in the wind. From a distance, the work of spring appeared successful, but this stage carried its own dangers, quieter and no less threatening. Summer demanded constant attention. Weeds grew quickly in warm soil, competing for water and nutrients. Farmers spent long hours bent over rows, pulling them by hand. The work was repetitive and slow, but neglect could cost everything. The heat brought new challenges. Sun burned exposed skin, dehydration weakened bodies already shaped by hunger and labor. There was no shade in open fields. Work continued anyway, because crops waited for no one. Animals became central again. Cows grazed freely now, producing more milk. Sheep fed steadily, their wool thickening. Pigs rooted through scraps and forest edges. Chickens ranged farther, laying eggs more regularly. Caring for animals remained essential. Illness still spread easily. Insects bothered livestock. Farmers watched for signs of weakness, limping, or refusal to eat. Losing an animal in summer could undo months of recovery. Summer storms were feared as much as welcomed. Rain was needed, but too much could flatten crops. Wind could snap stalks. Hail could destroy fields in minutes. Storm clouds were watched closely, their movement interpreted with experience rather than science. Pests arrived with the warmth. Insects ate leaves, birds pecked grain, rodents found ways into fields. Farmers used simple defenses, scarecrows, noise, fences, but none were reliable. The workday lengthened, sunrise came early, sunset came late. Farmers worked longer hours, pushing themselves while daylight allowed. Rest was brief and often restless. Meals improved slightly. Fresh milk, eggs, and greens made food feel less desperate. Still, nothing was wasted. Every resource was guarded carefully. Social life increased, but remained practical. Neighbors helped one another when storms damaged fields. Cooperation mattered more than celebration. Community was survival. Landowners monitored progress closely. Summer growth meant calculations. Taxes and rents were anticipated. Farmers knew that much of what grew would never belong fully to them. Children worked harder now. They carried water, guarded fields, learned responsibility early. Summer taught them endurance as surely as winter had taught patience. Despite exhaustion, something shifted internally. Fear lessened slightly, strength returned slowly. The body adjusted to labor again, but medieval farmers never forgot this truth. Between growth and harvest lay danger. Nothing was secure until grain was cut and stored, and so summer passed in watchful motion, filled with labor, hope, and constant awareness that survival still depended on forces beyond human control. As late summer arrived, medieval farmers felt the weight of the entire year settle onto their shoulders. The fields stood tall now, fuller and heavier than they had ever been. Grain bent in the wind. Stalks brushed against one another with a dry, whispering sound. From a distance, the land looked generous. Up close, it felt fragile. This was the most anxious time of the year. Nothing had been harvested yet, but everything depended on what stood before them. Months of labor, hunger, patience, and endurance were still at risk. One storm, one illness, one misjudgment could undo it all. Farmers walked their fields daily, sometimes several times a day. They checked the firmness of grain heads. They rubbed kernels between fingers. They watched for signs of disease, mold, or pests. They measured readiness not by calendars, but by touch, sound, and instinct passed down through generations. The timing of harvest mattered more than anything. Too early, and grain would be weak, difficult to store, and less nourishing. Too late, and rain, wind, or birds could destroy it. There was no perfect moment, only the least dangerous one. Tools were prepared carefully. Sickles were sharpened until their edges caught light. Wooden handles were checked for cracks. Ropes and sacks were mended again and again. Harvest tools were among the most important possessions a family owned, and failure now was unthinkable. Animals were rested deliberately. Oxen and horses were fed as well as possible, given time to recover strength. Harvest would demand long days of pulling loads and trampling fields. An exhausted animal could collapse under the strain. The household shifted its focus entirely. All other work faded into the background. Repairs could wait. Extra tasks were ignored. Everything now served one purpose: to bring the crop in safely. Meals were timed around preparation. Food was still simple, but eaten with more care. Strength was needed. No one ate more than necessary, but no one skipped meals if it could be avoided. Harvest required bodies that could last. Children were given new responsibilities. They watched fields for animals and birds. They gathered dropped grain. They carried water and tools. They learned quickly that mistakes now had consequences. Neighbors began speaking more often. Fields were compared. Weather was discussed endlessly. Quiet agreements were made about helping one another if storms came or illness struck. Community mattered most during harvest. The weather dominated every thought. Clouds were studied with intense focus. Wind direction was noted. Humidity was felt in the air. Even small changes seemed significant. Night brought little rest. Sleep came lightly, interrupted by worry. Farmers woke early, listening to wind and rain, hoping the sky would remain calm. Faith deepened again during this period. Prayers returned to urgency, not dramatic, but constant. People asked for protection, stability, and just enough time. Landowners and officials appeared more frequently. They inspected fields openly now. Their interest sharpened anxiety. Farmers knew that harvest would determine not only survival, but obligation. Despite fear, there was also pride. The fields were real. The work had mattered. Something had grown. Late summer taught medieval farmers a difficult truth. Survival was not won through effort alone, but through timing, restraint, and fortune. And so they stood at the edge of the most important moment of the year, surrounded by ripening grain, knowing that soon everything would be decided. The harvest did not begin with celebration, it began with quiet movement. Before sunrise, medieval farmers rose from their beds, dressed in worn clothes, and stepped outside into cool air. Dew rested on the fields. The grain stood heavy and still, waiting. This was the moment everything had led to. Months of hunger, cold, patience, and labor now depended on what happened next. There were no second chances. What was gathered in the coming days would determine survival through another winter. The first cuts were made carefully. Sickles moved slowly at first, testing the stalks, finding rhythm. Hands worked close to the ground. Each bundle was lifted, tied, and set aside. Grain fell in steady patterns, not rushed, not careless. Harvest was exhausting work. The posture alone strained the body. Hours bent forward caused pain in backs and legs. Blisters formed quickly. Sweat soaked clothing despite the cooler air. Still, no one stopped unless forced to. The days were long, work began early, and continued until light faded. Breaks were brief and practical. Water was shared. Food was eaten quickly in the field. Rest was a luxury reserved for night. Animals worked alongside people. Oxen pulled carts laden with sheaves. Horses moved steadily, trained to avoid trampling crops. Any injury to an animal now could slow everything, so care was constant. Children participated fully. They gathered loose grain, carried bundles, chased birds away. They learned that harvest was not optional. It was necessity made visible. Injuries were common: cuts from sickles, strained muscles, heat exhaustion. Most injuries were ignored unless severe. Pain was accepted as part of the season. Neighbors worked together. Fields were harvested in groups when possible. Cooperation meant speed and protection. A storm could destroy uncut grain in hours. Community reduced risk. Weather remained a threat until the last bundle was secured. Clouds were watched constantly. A sudden rain could flatten grain or cause rot. Every clear day was treated as precious. Faith remained close during harvest. Prayers were whispered between rows. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady requests for time and protection. As fields emptied, Relief began to surface, not joy yet, but release. The land slowly revealed bare soil. Where grain had stood tall, something had been saved. But the work was not finished. Grain still needed drying, threshing, storage. Harvest was a process, not a moment. Still, something shifted internally. Fear loosened its grip. Hunger felt temporary now, not endless. Survival seemed possible again. Evenings after harvest day were quiet. Bodies collapsed into rest. Hands ached. Muscles burned. Sleep came quickly, heavy and deep. Medieval farmers did not speak much during this time. Words were unnecessary. The work said enough. Harvest reminded them of a simple truth. Life could be taken away quickly, but it could also be gathered, slowly, with effort and care. And as the last sheaves were brought in, and the fields lay bare beneath the fading summer light, medieval farmers carried exhaustion, relief, and quiet gratitude into the night, knowing they had done everything they could. When the harvest ended, the land grew quiet again. The fields that had demanded so much attention now lay bare, stripped of grain and movement. But for medieval farmers, the work was far from finished. What had been cut still needed to be made safe. Threshing began soon after. Sheaves were carried to barns or open yards, depending on weather and space. Grain was separated from stalks by flails swung in slow, steady rhythm. The sound echoed softly, repetitive and hypnotic. Threshing was exhausting in a different way. Arms ached from repeated motion. Dust filled the air, coating throats and lungs. Chaff clung to skin and hair. Still, the work continued carefully. Grain damaged during threshing meant loss. Children helped where they could. They gathered fallen kernels. They learned to recognize what was valuable and what was waste. These lessons were quiet but lasting. After threshing came winnowing. Grain was tossed into the air so wind could carry away lighter chaff. Timing mattered. Too much wind scattered grain, too little left it dirty. Farmers watched the air closely, working with nature rather than against it. Storage was the most anxious stage. Grain was placed into sacks, bins, or pits, depending on region and tradition. Every container was checked for dampness, pests, and weakness. Poor storage could ruin everything months later. Rodents were constant enemies. Cats were valued highly. Traps were set. Grain was raised off the ground where possible. Even so, some loss was expected. Nothing was ever perfectly safe. For the first time in months, hunger eased, meals became fuller. Fresh bread was baked, porridge thickened. Bodies felt warmth return, not just from fire, but from nourishment. Emotionally, something loosened. The constant tension that had lived beneath every task began to fade. Farmers slept more deeply. Laughter returned quietly to some homes. Still, obligations followed quickly. Rents were due, tithes were collected, landowners claimed their share. Grain that represented survival was divided carefully, sometimes painfully. This was a moment of mixed feeling. Relief existed alongside resentment. Farmers knew their labor had sustained others as much as themselves. Community gatherings followed. Shared meals, modest feasts, and quiet celebration marked survival. These were not grand events, they were acknowledgments, proof that effort had not been wasted. Faith shifted again. Prayers became thankful rather than pleading. Saints' days were observed with more ease. Survival was attributed to grace as much as labor. As autumn approached, preparation resumed. Winter was already being imagined. Repairs began again. Fuel was gathered. Animals were assessed for slaughter or sale. The cycle did not stop. It only changed pace. But for now, medieval farmers allowed themselves a moment of rest. A pause, a breath. The fields were silent, but the barns were full, and that silence carried meaning. After the grain was secured, medieval farmers entered a different kind of season. Autumn did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, carried by cooler air, shorter days, and the subtle awareness that winter was already approaching. Relief from harvest faded into preparation once more. The land changed its voice. Fields no longer whispered with grain. Instead, they lay open and quiet, dark soil exposed beneath fading sunlight. Leaves yellowed and fell. Wind felt sharper. The year was turning again. Autumn labor shifted indoors and closer to home. Attention moved from fields to barns, pens, and storehouses. Animals became the center of daily work. Their condition would determine how the household survived the cold months ahead. Decisions were made carefully. Not every animal could be kept through winter. Feed was limited, shelter was finite. Farmers assessed each cow, pig, sheep, and goat, weighing need against reality. These choices were practical, but never easy. Slaughter usually began in late autumn. It was done with seriousness, not celebration. Animals that had been cared for all year were killed quickly, with as little waste as possible. Nothing was taken lightly. Survival required respect for the act. The work was physical and emotionally heavy. Blood stained the ground. Steam rose into cold air. Children watched quietly or were sent away, depending on custom. Life and death were not hidden from medieval families. They were understood as part of the same cycle. Preservation followed immediately. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Fat was rendered. Bones were saved for broth. Hides were cleaned and stretched. Every usable part was claimed. Inside the home, fires burned longer again. The smell of smoke mixed with meat and herbs. Women and older children worked steadily, hands busy, minds focused. Preservation required patience and precision. A mistake could mean illness or loss later. Food stores grew slowly, barrels filled, hooks lined with meat. Shelves held dried herbs, grains, and roots. Each addition brought reassurance, but never comfort enough to relax fully. Autumn meals were fuller, but deliberate. Fresh meat appeared briefly, then disappeared again into storage. This short abundance was enjoyed quietly, with awareness that it would not last. Animals remaining for winter were cared for closely. Shelter was repaired, bedding was replaced, feed was measured. These animals represented warmth, milk, labor, and life through the cold months ahead. Social rhythms changed again. Work slowed slightly. Neighbors visited more often. Stories were shared. Losses from the year were spoken aloud, now that survival was more secure. Faith returned to reflection. Prayers thanked not just God, but the year itself, the land, the weather, the endurance of bodies and animals. Gratitude mixed with humility. Children sensed the shift. They spent less time in fields and more indoors. Lessons turned toward winter tasks. Their world narrowed again. Autumn evenings grew longer. Light faded earlier. Fires burned brighter. The outside world felt distant once more. And in this quiet turning, medieval farmers felt something familiar returning. Not fear yet, but awareness. Winter was coming again. Survival had been earned, but it would need to be defended all over again. So autumn passed slowly, marked by careful preparation, reflection, and acceptance. The cycle continued, steady and unbroken. Early winter returned quietly, without ceremony. Cold slipped back into the land as if it had never truly left. Frost crept across fields in the mornings. Breath became visible again. Fires were lit earlier each day. Medieval farmers recognized the feeling immediately. The year was closing in on itself. The rhythm of life narrowed once more. Work pulled inward. Fields were abandoned to frost and darkness. Attention returned to the home, the barn, the fire, and the animals that remained. Movement slowed, not from choice, but from necessity. Days shortened quickly. Light faded before tasks felt finished. Shadows filled corners of homes. Oil lamps and candles became precious again, used carefully, extinguished early to save resources. Darkness was not frightening, but it was heavy. Winter routines returned almost automatically. Feed was measured, fires were tended, water was hauled carefully to prevent freezing. Every task carried memory. This had been done before, many times, by many generations. The body remembered winter, joints stiffened, old injuries ached, cold settled deep into bones. Work was slower now, but no less demanding. Winter punished carelessness. Animals were brought closer. Cows, goats, and sheep remained sheltered. Oh, their warmth valuable. Chickens stayed inside longer. Dogs slept near fires. Life clustered together for survival. Food stores were checked constantly. Barrels were opened and resealed. Grain was inspected for dampness. Meat was checked for spoilage. Preservation was an ongoing task, not a finished one. Meals became predictable again. Porridge, bread, broth, the variety of autumn faded into repetition. Hunger was controlled now, but never forgotten. Emotionally, winter pressed inward. The outward focus of harvest and autumn had passed. Thought turned inward. People reflected on losses, endurance, and what the year had demanded. Silence returned naturally. Stories became more important. Evenings were filled with memory and repetition. Tales of past winters, spirits, saints, and warnings passed quietly between generations. These stories were not entertainment, they were instruction and reassurance. Superstition lived alongside faith. Winter nights were long, strange sounds carried farther, shadows moved unpredictably in firelight. People believed in signs, omens, and unseen forces, not out of fear, but out of respect for what could not be controlled. Protection rituals returned, symbols were marked, prayers were spoken at thresholds, objects were placed near doors and beds. These acts offered comfort when certainty was impossible. Children listened carefully. Winter shaped imagination. The world felt larger and more mysterious at night. Lessons were absorbed without explanation. Community grew quieter but closer. Visits were fewer but more meaningful. A shared meal, a borrowed tool, a few spoken words mattered deeply. Faith deepened through repetition. Prayers followed familiar patterns. Comfort came from sameness rather than hope. Winter asked not for optimism, but endurance. Sleep came earlier, bodies surrendered to darkness, rest became heavier, slower, dreams blended memory and fear, comfort and uncertainty. Medieval farmers did not ask winter to be kind, they asked it to be survivable. And as the early winter settled fully over the land once more, life drew inward again, steady and quiet, repeating a pattern older than memory itself. Deep winter settled fully now, and with it came a different kind of stillness. The land no longer changed from day to day. Fields lay frozen and silent. Trees stood bare and unmoving. The outside world felt distant, almost unreal, as if life existed only within the circle of warmth around the hearth. This was the season when space felt smaller. Homes became the center of existence. Most days passed without leaving the immediate surroundings. The barn, the fire, the sleeping place, and the table formed the boundaries of daily life. Time slowed further. Without planting or harvest to measure the days, winter was marked by routine. Fires were lit and fed, meals were cooked and eaten, animals were checked, light came and went, the same actions repeated gently, offering structure when nothing else did. Feast days broke the monotony. They were not extravagant for farmers, but they were meaningful. A little more food, a special dish, a shared meal with neighbors, if travel allowed. These moments reminded people that winter had shape, that time was still moving forward. Faith filled the long nights, church festivals, saints' days, and holy observances provided rhythm. Candles were lit, stories were retold. Belief offered explanation where the world felt uncertain and dark. Food was still guarded carefully. Feasts did not mean excess, they meant temporary easing. Afterwards, restraint returned. Nothing was wasted. Winter punished indulgence. Children felt winter differently. Confined indoors, they learned patience. They listened to stories. They watched adults work. Their world shrank, but their understanding grew quietly. Animals remained constant companions. Their presence brought reassurance, warmth, sound. Life moved around the household, even when the outside world felt lifeless. Silence deepened during these months. Snow muffled sound. Wind whispered. Even voices seemed softer. Silence was not loneliness, but containment, a holding space. People reflected more in winter. There was time to remember those lost during the year, time to consider mistakes, time to think about spring, even if it felt distant. Superstitions returned strongly. In deep winter, long nights encouraged belief in unseen things. Protective charms were kept close. Certain words were avoided. These practices provided comfort rather than fear. Community connection mattered greatly. A visit during deep winter meant effort, it meant care. These moments strengthened bonds more than busy seasons ever could. The body adapted to winter's pace. Movement slowed, energy was conserved, sleep lengthened. Winter demanded less action and more endurance. Despite hardship, small joys existed: warm food, familiar voices, firelight, shared silence. These moments were quiet but deeply valued. Deep winter taught medieval farmers something essential. Life did not always expand. Sometimes it contracted, and within that smaller space, meaning could still exist. As the longest nights passed and days slowly began to lengthen again, farmers remained steady, living quietly within their routines, trusting that the cycle would turn once more. Late winter arrived almost without notice. There was no clear moment when it began. Instead, it revealed itself slowly, through subtle changes that medieval farmers learned to recognize without speaking of them aloud. The cold remained, but it felt different now. Not as sharp, not as relentless. Morning frost still coated the ground, but it lingered a little less each day. Snow softened sooner. The air carried a faint promise of movement. Light returned quietly. Days lengthened by minutes, then by moments that could be felt rather than measured. Evenings held a trace of brightness that had been absent for months. Firelight competed with daylight again. Bodies responded before minds did. Sleep shifted. People rose slightly earlier. Energy returned in small amounts. Joints still ached, but movement felt less punishing. Food stores were watched carefully. Late winter was always dangerous. The longest stretch had passed, but reserves were low. Farmers counted what remained and measured each meal with care, aware that spring was close, but not yet present. Animals showed subtle signs of change. They stirred more often. Their coats shed slightly. They sought light. Farmers noticed these signs with cautious attention. Animals often sensed the turning of seasons before people allowed themselves to believe it. Work began to shift once again. Tools were inspected, repairs resumed. The thought of planting returned quietly, not with excitement, but with acceptance. Another cycle waited. Emotionally, late winter carried reflection. Survival brought relief, but also weariness. Farmers remembered those who had not made it through the year. Loss was acknowledged now, when fear had loosened its grip. Faith took on a reflective tone. Prayers thanked endurance rather than asking for it. Gratitude was quiet and private. Survival felt fragile but real. Children sensed the change clearly. They watched melting snow. They lingered near doors. They felt the world expanding again, even if slowly. Community awareness returned. Farmers noticed smoke rising from distant homes more often. Signs of life reappeared across the landscape. Winter's isolation began to thin. Late winter was not joyful. It was thoughtful, a pause between endurance and effort, a moment to breathe before work returned fully. Farmers understood what this moment meant. They had survived another year, not triumphantly, not easily, but completely. And as winter loosened its hold once more, medieval farmers stood quietly at the edge of another turning, aware that life would soon demand their strength again, but grateful for the chance to offer it. The first true signs of spring did not arrive with celebration. They came softly, almost shyly, as if the land itself was cautious after such a long winter. Medieval farmers noticed the change, not through warmth, but through movement. Water flowed again, frozen streams cracked open and began to run, snow retreated into shadows. The earth released a damp scent that had been absent for months. This smell carried memory. It meant life was stirring below the surface. Morning routines changed subtly. Fires were still lit, but later, doors were opened more often, light entered homes more freely. The world outside felt reachable again. The land looked tired, much like the people who lived upon it. The fields were bare and dark, marked by the passing of seasons. But beneath that surface, seeds waited. Farmers did not rush to disturb the soil. They had learned patience through winter. Animals moved differently now. They stretched, they wandered, they tested space beyond their shelters. Their quiet confidence reassured the household more than any sign in the sky. Food remained limited, but hope was no longer dangerous. Foraged greens returned, milk increased, hunger loosened its grip, not fully, but enough to breathe more easily. People spoke of the coming work calmly. There was no excitement, only acceptance. Another year would ask for strength, effort, and endurance. Survival would need to be earned again. Children sensed renewal most clearly. They stepped outside longer. They asked questions. They followed animals and watched water move. Spring felt like possibility to them, even when adults remained cautious. Faith shifted gently. Prayers became anticipatory rather than desperate. Gratitude remained, but expectation joined it quietly. Communities slowly reassembled, paths reopened, visits resumed, news traveled again. The world widened beyond the hearth. The memory of winter did not disappear. It stayed in the body, in habits, in restraint. Winter shaped how farmers entered spring, reminding them not to trust abundance too easily. This moment between survival and effort mattered deeply. It was a pause, a breath, a chance to stand still before moving forward again. Medieval farmers did not see this as a beginning or an ending. It was simply continuation, life returning to motion, asking once more for patience and care. And as the year quietly began again, they stepped forward without ceremony, carrying what the past seasons had taught them, ready to endure, to work, and to remain. For medieval farmers, time was not measured the way we measure it now. There were no clocks guiding the day, no calendars marking weeks with precision. Time was something felt through the body, through light, weather, hunger, and work. Morning began when the sky allowed it. Evening ended when darkness demanded rest. Days stretched or contracted with the seasons. Summer felt long and demanding. Winter felt endless and heavy. Time itself seemed to slow when survival became difficult. The year was not divided into months, but into needs. Planting time, hungry time, harvest time, cold time. Each carried its own rhythm, its own expectations. Farmers did not hurry through seasons, they endured them. Routine shaped perception. Repeating the same tasks day after day created a steady calm, feeding animals, tending fire, preparing meals. These actions anchored people when the world felt uncertain. Memory lived alongside routine. Every task carried reminders of past years. A field remembered famine, a barn remembered loss, a tool remembered injury. Experience guided behavior more than instruction. Winter had taught restraint. Even in spring and summer, farmers conserved energy and resources. They did not trust abundance. Scarcity had shaped their instincts. Belief filled the gaps where knowledge ended. Weather, illness, fortune, and loss were interpreted through faith and tradition. This was not ignorance, it was a way to live with uncertainty. Festivals marked time gently. They were pauses, not distractions. Moments to acknowledge survival, community, and continuity. They reminded farmers that life was shared, not endured alone. Children learned time differently. They watched seasons change rather than dates pass. Their education came from observation, repetition, and responsibility. Aging was felt more than counted. Bodies remembered winters. Hands showed years of labor. Time marked people physically, shaping posture, strength, and endurance. Sleep was not separate from time. Long nights in winter invited deep rest. Short summer nights demanded resilience. Sleep followed the land's rhythm. Loss shaped time profoundly. Deaths did not stop the year, but they slowed it. Memory lingered in familiar places. The absence of someone was felt season after season. Despite hardship, life continued steadily, not with ambition or urgency, but with persistence. Time did not rush medieval farmers, it carried them forward, whether they wished it or not. This relationship with time shaped everything. It softened expectations. It taught patience. It demanded acceptance. Medieval farmers did not chase the future. They prepared for it quietly. And as seasons repeated, year after year, time became less something to control and more something to live within, gently, carefully, and completely. Death was never far from medieval farming life. It did not arrive as a sudden interruption, but as a presence that moved quietly alongside the seasons. People did not speak of it constantly, yet they were always aware of it, especially after winter had taken its toll. Most families had lost someone, a child taken by illness, a parent weakened by years of labor, a neighbor who did not survive the cold. Loss was familiar, not shocking. It shaped how people understood life itself. Grief was real, but it was contained. There was little space for extended mourning. Work continued because it had to. Animals still needed care. Fields still needed attention. Survival did not pause for sorrow. This did not mean loss was ignored. Names were remembered. Stories were told. A place by the fire remained empty. Absence was felt quietly. Day after day, burials were simple and direct. There were prayers spoken softly. A gathering, if weather allowed. Then life moved forward. Winter did not wait, and neither could the living. Children learned about death early. They were not shielded from it. They watched animals die. They attended burials. Death was understood as part of the cycle, not as something separate from life. Faith provided structure for grief. Loss was explained through belief. Souls moved on. The living endured. This framework did not erase pain, but it gave it shape. Aging was another quiet companion. Bodies changed slowly over years of work. Strength faded, movement slowed. Older farmers shifted to lighter tasks, offering knowledge rather than labor. Respect for elders was practical, not ceremonial. Experience mattered, memory mattered. Those who had survived many winters carried knowledge that protected the household. Growing old on the land meant accepting limitation. There was no retirement, only adjustment. Work was reduced, not abandoned. The presence of loss influenced decisions. Food was stored carefully. Animals were treated with respect. Risks were weighed cautiously. Memory guided restraint. Grief returned seasonally. Anniversaries were not marked on calendars, but felt when certain tasks or times returned. A winter remembered, a harvest missed. Despite this, life continued steadily. Laughter returned, meals were shared, children grew. The cycle did not stop because of loss. This endurance was not hardness, it was adaptation. Medieval farmers learned to carry grief without letting it consume everything else. Death did not define their lives, survival did. And so they lived beside loss, not above it or beneath it, but alongside it, allowing memory to exist without stopping the work of living. For medieval farmers, The world did not end at what could be touched or seen. Beyond the fields, the animals, and the firelight, there existed another layer of reality, one shaped by belief, memory, and quiet fear. This unseen world was not distant. It lived close, especially during long nights and uncertain seasons. Darkness carried meaning. Without artificial light, night felt deep and complete. Shadows moved with the fire. Sounds traveled farther. A branch scraping against a wall, or the wind shifting suddenly, could feel intentional. People did not panic at these moments, but they paid attention. Superstition grew from experience rather than imagination. When illness struck without warning, when crops failed despite effort, when animals died suddenly, people searched for reasons. Belief offered explanations when knowledge did not. Protective rituals became part of daily life. Symbols were carved into door frames. Certain objects were kept near beds or hung above thresholds. Words were spoken softly before sleep. These acts were not dramatic. They were quiet habits, practiced consistently. The home was treated as a boundary. Inside was warmth, safety, and order. Outside was uncertainty. Doors were closed carefully at night. Fires were banked properly. Beds were positioned with intention. Protection began with routine. Certain times of year were believed to be thinner, moments when the boundary between worlds felt weaker, long winter nights, seasonal transitions, stormy weather. During these times, people behaved more cautiously, avoided unnecessary travel, and stayed close to home. Animals were seen as sensitive to the unseen: a restless cow, a dog growling at nothing, a sudden silence in the barn. These signs were taken seriously. Animals were believed to notice what humans could not. Children absorbed these beliefs naturally. They learned which places felt safe and which did not. They listened to stories without questioning their truth. Fear was not encouraged, but awareness was. Faith and superstition existed side by side. Prayer and ritual blended seamlessly. One did not replace the other. Together, they formed a way of living with uncertainty. Protection was rarely about controlling the unseen, it was about respect, acknowledging forces beyond human reach, acting carefully rather than boldly. Winter intensified these beliefs. Isolation, darkness, and silence invited imagination. People slept closer together, fires burned longer, familiar words and prayers were repeated nightly. Despite belief in unseen forces, life was not ruled by fear. Most days passed quietly, work continued, meals were shared, protection existed in the background, not the foreground. The unseen world offered explanation, not terror. It helped people understand misfortune without blaming themselves entirely. It softened guilt and uncertainty. As seasons turned, these beliefs remained steady. They did not disappear with daylight or abundance. They simply shifted, adapting to new conditions. For medieval farmers, the unseen was not separate from life. It was woven into routine, shaping behavior gently rather than dramatically. And so they lived with both worlds at once, the visible and the invisible, grounded in labor, comforted by belief, and guided by quiet respect for what could not be fully understood. As years passed, medieval farmers began to feel time differently, not as something ahead of them, but as something layered behind them. Seasons no longer felt new. They felt familiar, repeating patterns that had already been lived many times before. Aging arrived quietly. It did not announce itself. It revealed itself through smaller signs. Slower movement in the morning, stiffer joints in cold air, a need to rest more often between tasks. These changes were accepted without complaint. They were expected. Older farmers did not stop working. They adjusted. Heavy labor passed to younger hands. Lighter tasks remained: feeding animals, repairing tools, watching the sky. Their roles shifted from strength to awareness. Knowledge became their greatest contribution. They remembered when to plant despite unusual weather. They knew which field flooded first, which animal required special care, which signs warned of coming frost. This knowledge had been earned through survival. Younger generations listened closely, not always with enthusiasm, but with necessity. Advice mattered, mistakes were costly, experience carried weight that no written instruction could replace. Learning was constant and informal. Children absorbed skills by watching, by helping, by repeating tasks until movement became natural. No one announced lessons. Life itself taught them. Stories carried memory forward, tales of past winters, of failed harvests, of storms survived. These stories were told not to frighten, but to prepare. Memory became instruction. Loss shaped teaching. Older farmers spoke of what had gone wrong as often as what had gone right. These warnings mattered. They protected the future. Faith matured with age. Belief became quieter, less urgent, less about asking, and more about accepting. Gratitude replaced fear. Survival felt less miraculous and more earned. Community respected age practically. Elders were consulted. Their words guided decisions. Authority came not from title, but from endurance. Death approached without surprise. Older farmers felt it as part of the cycle. They prepared quietly. They passed on tools. They gave instructions. They trusted the land would continue. Grief, when it came, was shaped by continuity. The work did not stop. Fields were planted, animals were fed. Life moved forward with memory intact. Children stepped into roles gradually. Responsibility grew year by year. Strength replaced youth. Confidence replaced uncertainty. The land accepted them as it had accepted those before. Time felt circular rather than linear. Each year echoed the last. Differences mattered, but repetition offered reassurance. The cycle itself became a source of calm. Winter returned again and again. Each time it felt familiar. Each time it demanded endurance. Each time it was survived slightly differently. Spring returned with the same caution. Hope remained measured. Experience shaped expectation. Abundance was never assumed. Harvest remained the central test. Each year stood on its own, but memory guided hands and decisions. Life on the land did not seek progress. It sought balance, enough food, enough warmth, enough time. People grew old knowing this truth. Survival was not heroic, it was consistent. The land did not remember individuals, but it carried their influence. Fields shaped by hands long gone, paths worn smooth by generations of movement. This continuity brought comfort. To live was to participate in something larger than oneself. To endure was to contribute to the future. And so medieval farming life moved forward, year after year, shaped by memory, guided by experience, and sustained by the quiet understanding that life did not need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. It only needed to continue. Long after individual years blended together, medieval farmers understood something quietly. The land did not hurry. It did not pause. It simply continued, season after season, asking the same things in different ways. Fields remembered hands that worked them. Paths worn smooth by countless footsteps guided new ones. Fences repaired again and again carried marks of many winters. Nothing felt new, but nothing felt finished either. Routine became comfort. Waking before light, tending fire, feeding animals, preparing food. These actions required no thought anymore. They grounded the day. Even when the future felt uncertain, routine offered stability. The body adapted to repetition. Movements grew efficient. Effort was measured. Energy was conserved naturally. Life taught restraint better than instruction ever could. The land shaped people as much as people shaped the land. Soil hardened hands, weather taught humility, hunger taught patience, abundance taught caution. Farmers no longer asked if life would be easier, they asked only if it would be survivable, and often that was enough. Time lost sharp edges. Years were not compared, they were endured. Memory blended seasons together. A good year softened the memory of a bad one. A harsh winter sharpened respect for preparation. Children grew into adults without ceremony. Responsibilities increased naturally. Knowledge passed without formal teaching. Strength replaced youth. Calm replaced impatience. Old age arrived quietly. People slowed. They spoke less. They watched more. Their presence remained valuable even when their labor faded. The land accepted everyone equally. It rewarded effort sometimes. It punished mistakes often. It remembered nothing personally, yet it carried every influence forward. Winter returned again, always a winter, always familiar, always demanding, but never surprising. Spring followed, carefully, slowly, without promise. Summer tested endurance, autumn measured results, and the cycle repeated, unbroken. There was no final chapter for medieval farmers, no conclusion, only continuation. Life was not a story with an ending. It was a rhythm, and within that rhythm, people found meaning not in progress, but in persistence, as fires burned low and nights stretched long, as dawn returned again and again. Medieval farmers lived quietly within the land's slow breathing, contributing their effort, their memory, their presence. Nothing needed to be resolved, nothing needed to be finished. The land remained, the cycle turned, and life continued, steady, patient, and calm. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt settled. Days passed without needing to be remembered individually. Morning arrived, fire was stirred, animals shifted in their sleep. The same motions returned again and again until they no longer felt like effort, only presence. Winter nights lengthened once more. Snow muted the world. Sound softened. Even thoughts slowed, drifting without urgency. People slept longer, waking and resting in rhythms shaped by darkness rather than intention. Inside the home, nothing changed quickly. Wood cracked in the hearth, breath fogged the air, hands warmed slowly. Meals were prepared without variety, but with care. Familiar tastes brought comfort simply because they were familiar. Outside, the land rested, fields lay untouched, fences stood still, paths disappeared beneath snow and reappeared later, exactly where they had always been. Nothing asked to be done, nothing could be rushed. The body learned stillness again. Movement became smaller, energy was saved, cold encouraged patience. The pace of life lowered itself naturally, without resistance. Thoughts wandered gently, memories surfaced without effort. Past winters blurred together, faces appeared and faded, no single moment demanded attention. Everything belonged to the same long experience of living. Faith, belief, and routine blended seamlessly. There was no need to separate them. Words were spoken quietly, gestures repeated them automatically. Comfort came from repetition rather than certainty. Animals slept more deeply. Their presence was steady and reassuring. Warmth gathered where bodies clustered together. Life remained close, shared, and quiet. Time lost meaning beyond light and dark. There was no counting, no measuring, only awareness of endurance continuing. Nothing needed improvement, nothing needed explanation. The land breathed slowly beneath frost, waiting. And the people waited too, not anxiously, not impatiently, but in harmony with the pause. They had done this before. They would do it again. Life did not demand attention. It simply continued. Firelight flickered, silence held, and within that silence, everything that needed to exist already did. Eventually, even waiting stopped feeling like waiting. It became simply living within stillness. Breath rose and fell. Fire dimmed and brightened again. Outside, the land remained quiet, holding its shape beneath cold and time. Nothing needed to change for rest to arrive. Nothing needed to be understood. The year had passed in its own way, not as a story with a beginning or an end, but as a slow movement through effort, hunger, warmth, loss, and return. Every season had left its trace, not as memory alone, but as instinct. Hands that once worked fields now rested. Bodies that had endured cold and labor settled into calm. Thoughts softened, no longer moving forward or backward, only drifting. The land did not ask to be remembered, it asked only to be lived upon. And the people who had shaped it, season by season, did not linger in noise or celebration. They remained in quiet continuity, in habits passed forward, in paths worn smooth, in routines repeated without question. Night held everything gently. Snow, soil, stone, breath, and fire all shared the same slow rhythm. Nothing was missing, nothing was required. Life, as it had always been here, rested inside its own persistence. And so the world remained calm, unhurried, and whole, allowing sleep to come naturally without effort, without instruction, simply by being still long enough for rest to find it.